Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. And I just want to welcome you to this really important conversation with Mahmoud, who is a Palestinian graduate of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and his attorney, Baher Azmi. He's the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is at the forefront of a lot of the battles to protect American civil liberties today. We're going to talk about one of the most urgent issues of our time, which is the suppression of dissenting voices in what remains of our democracy. Just over a year ago, Mahmoud, you were thrust into the spotlight. You were the first person detained by ICE in Trump's second term for engaging in student activism. Footage taken by your wife showed you being snatched and arrested from the lobby of your New York City apartment building over a political speech the government didn't like, specifically your advocacy for Palestinian rights and your organizing on the Columbia University campus to protest U.S. support for Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Since then, international media has been covering every development in your case, and your arrest kicked off a sweeping legal and political battle over free speech in the U.S. It's a historic struggle that you both remain at the forefront of today, and one that is not only deeply personal consequences for you and your family, but huge implications for all of us concerned about civil liberties in America. So I'm really grateful for you being here today.
Thank you so much.
I want to start with the time before your arrest. What got you to become involved in the Palestinian solidarity movement at Columbia?
Thank you so much, Betsy, and it's really an honor to be here with you all. I did not discover, I would say, like the Palestine movement at Columbia because I was born into it as a Palestinian, born and raised in a Palestinian refugee camp in Syria. I was surrounded by what it means to be a Palestinian, stateless, without any rights. My family was violently exiled from Palestine. So I took that along all my life, whether my life in Syria and Lebanon and at Columbia. And I came with an understanding to Columbia that it is a great space to have such difficult conversations about Palestine. And that was before October 7, before anything happened. So I felt that, that's what universities are designed for, to have free thought, free conversation without the fear of persecution. And that's how I got involved, basically, at Columbia organizing in specific.
So I'm sure many of you in the audience have seen the video, millions saw it, of your arrest, but I wonder if you could describe to us in your own words what happened on that day when you were returning to your home and you encountered Homeland Security agents there.
It's, every time, I try to repeat it, just like it comes with the same heaviness about walking back home after dinner with my 8-month pregnant wife, to be then chased by ICE agents who refused to show warrant. That was the first thing when they asked me, are you Mahmoud Khalil? I asked them who you are, and they said DHS. So I was like, do you have a warrant? Because that's the first thing you learn and know your rights, ask for a warrant. And they wouldn't show me. They first accused me of having a student visa, which I didn't. I was a lawful permanent resident. But yet, even when I tried to call my lawyer, they wouldn't give her any answer. And until that moment, to be honest, I felt that there is some sort of misunderstanding, because the week or 2 weeks preceding that, March 8, exactly 1 year ago, these 2 weeks, there were a lot of baseless smears and intimidation against me online. I did not really care about that. I knew I did not commit any crime. I had an understanding that we have a very solid First Amendment rights in this country. Why would I worry about anything? So even when my friends would text me about, all these tweets from these shadowy right-wing or even anti-Palestinian hate groups, I did not really care about about that much. But to find myself 2 hours later in an ICE office, Federal 26 Plaza, until that moment, I was like, there's a misunderstanding. It will be cleared up in a minute. But then I heard like an officer approaching his superior saying the White House is requesting an update about the case. And it was like, holy shit, you know, like that's like a real thing. It's like they knew that I did not commit any crime, yet they proceeded with that. So that's, I think, in the next 36 hours, I was moved from New York to New Jersey, to New York, to Texas, to Louisiana within 36 hours, not allowed to speak like to my lawyers, to my wife, nothing at all. So these were like the most difficult hours, like throughout the 104 days that I was detained, like during.
Baher, I'd love to turn to you. What was the government's legal justification for that arrest, and was there any precedent for this kind of prosecution based on protected speech?
Yeah, so as Mahmoud said, he was never charged or accused of any crime, and the arrest wasn't based on any unlawful conduct. It was based exclusively on his constitutionally protected advocacy. So what in particular happened is Secretary Rubio invoked a very obscure provision of the immigration laws that permits, in theory, the United States to designate someone as deportable if their presence would produce an adverse foreign policy consequence, would be adverse to the foreign policy interests of the United States. And that's what he invoked, claiming that Mahmoud engaged in anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas activity, and which was defined exclusively through this like really persistent conflation narrative by conflating mere advocacy for Palestinian human rights and criticism of U.S. support for Israel state policies, namely a genocide unfolding against his people. That's the exclusive reason for his detention. And just to sort of take a step back, why? It starts actually with the Heritage Project. There's a lot of the authoritarian plans from Project 2025 have some very powerful, prominent Zionists in the Trump administration before were anti-Palestinian Zionists, I should say, in the Heritage Foundation, and produced this blueprint basically called Project Esther, by which they would recruit these proto-fascist anti-Palestinian groups, Canary Mission and Beitar, and they're in conversation with Stephen Miller about this, to identify students, non-citizen students, who are in the Palestinian human rights movement and target them. In the past, all these groups could do was sort of dox students or prevent them from getting employment or prevent Palestinian students from entering Israel. But this time, they're well aware that they knew they had a friendly administration. They could ratchet up the repressive practices to this like really high authoritarian level, and specify particularly that they would invoke the immigration laws, weaponize them to arrest, detain, and deport pro-Palestinian non-citizen students. And Mahmoud was the first of them. And you asked if there's precedent. No, not under these particular laws. It's kind of incredible that the United States Department of State, which has for 80 years condemned this kind of practice, namely imprisoning people for dissenting from state policy, what we have called that historically is arbitrary detention. The State Department, that's been 80 years of policy, and what we would call the victim of that is a political prisoner. And for 80 years, the State Department policy has been to condemn regimes who engage in this practice, like, for example, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and others who we now sort of invade on the pretense that they are somehow authoritarian. So I just sort of want to be clear that this is really a key part of the authoritarian project and certainly will not end with Palestinian students.
Absolutely, thank you. Mahmoud, you have had the full weight of the Trump administration's campaign against campus Palestinian activism come down on you, but you haven't been cowed into silence. While in detention, you published a number of op-eds in The Guardian about your ordeal, but also about Gaza. And you're here today, which we're very grateful for. What has given you the courage to keep speaking out, even as you remain in a somewhat precarious position?
I mean, it's a very precarious position, but it's a privileged one as well. Like, I consider myself as one of the privileged Palestinians who made it out of the misery, out of the bombs, the killing in Palestine. So I felt, especially as Bahar mentioned, that they targeted me to make an example out of me, not for committing any crimes, just like to make an example, to chill speech across the country. So I really had two options. The first option, just like say nothing and hope for the best, or like to actually speak out and really say why I was targeted. I was targeted because I represent a movement calling for freedom, justice, and dignity for Palestinians. And they had to center that because I felt I was not the story. The story is Palestine. The story is the violence and the killing that's happening in Palestine. And I'm just a distraction from that. And that what gave me sort of the purpose, especially after seeing another part of it, when I was reading the news or when I was calling Noor, my wife, she would update me on the news, and just all these baseless smears against me from people talking on my behalf or imposing some sort of misattributions about who I am, what I stand for. So I felt I have to speak up myself, and taking the risk despite the lawyers opposition to do anything, because at that point we were in uncharted waters. No one knew what's happening. No one knew, Bahar was tracking flights to Guantanamo, fearing that maybe the government would send me there. But I just felt I had a roof above my head. My wife will deliver in a hospital. She has a support system, but the people in Palestine, they don't have any of that.
Do you want to say specifically how you feel your views and your values have been misconstrued?
I think that's one of the most difficult parts about my case is the deliberate, the deliberate misconstruction of my views, what I stand for. Who I am, and the use of this demonizing, vilifying language. The first thing they said, terrorist supporter or Hamas sympathizer. But now we see that's the first, that's the language. Unfortunately, they used to dehumanize anyone who's standing or dissenting, with Renee Good and Alex Pretty, immediately they called them domestic terrorists without any sort of, investigation whatsoever. But that's very deliberate, to dehumanize us. But I'm thankful, my record is very clear about what I stand for, which is, again, the Palestine freedom movement is a movement for justice for everyone, regardless of their background. That's what we're calling for. We're calling that we should all be safe. No one's right to safety comes at the expense of others' rights to safety.
Right. Thank you. Bahar, could you walk us through the status of Mahmoud's case today?
Yeah, so it's a bit complicated. It starts as the administration frequently wants these cases to start through the immigration laws, which give the executive branch enormous power. And so they put Mahmoud through immigration proceedings. also very specifically tried to whisk him as quickly as possible out of New York, where where his family is and where his lawyers are, for this kind of two effects: an in terrorem effect, because again, they want to make him the example. So they shifted him off to a remote ICE detention facility in central Louisiana, where they did or tried to send all of the Palestinian activists they targeted under this plan before. And Louisiana and the Deep South is sort of like represents this sort of immigration gulag, our archipelago, not Siberia physically, but Siberia legally, where the immigration courts are barely credible, and the Court of Appeals in that jurisdiction is very favorable to the government, but also meant to send a message: this will happen to you. So they're pushing to deport him through the immigration courts, and let's call them, and the immigration courts, this is very important, they're not real courts. They're not independent. They are part of the executive branch. The immigration judges in this case answer to the Attorney General and the President of the United States. So let's call them the President's courts. That's where they want, and they want to kind of persecute and prosecute Mahmoud. We, as his lawyers, filed a petition for habeas corpus to try and get a real court, a constitutional court, a United States federal district court, to review the constitutionality of the very attempt to weaponize the immigration laws in order to suppress speech. It's a First Amendment-based detention that's happening here, and we needed an independent court that cares about the Constitution and not just the president's policy prerogatives to weigh in on that. And in fact, the federal judge in our case, as the immigration courts were like rubber stamping the basis for his detention. Sorry, I keep referring to the Soviet Union. I sort of grew up in the 80s and, on Solzhenitsyn and Orwell. But watching his, on WebEx, watching his immigration case in front of this incredibly hostile immigration judge, as his lawyers were begging to take discovery, to get a continuance, to introduce evidence to show that this is unconstitutional. She would have nothing of it. It was a show trial, and I've read about show trials, but it was very, very chilling to watch it in real time. So back to the federal court agreed with us, as all the federal courts who have reviewed these cases have, and said this is an unconstitutional detention. You cannot remove him on this foreign policy ground. Now, unfortunately, the government appealed, and we got a disappointing split decision in the Court of Appeals that didn't touch the constitutional questions. It simply sort of addressed this narrow jurisdictional question and suggested, very worryingly, that we're not allowed to go to a constitutional court. We have to go through the president's courts. They think some obscure provisions of the immigration laws take away the capacity for constitutional courts to review these claims. And so that's a disappointing decision, because we don't obviously trust the immigration courts, but we're pursuing further appeals. It's a 2-to-1 decision. It's sort of contrary to governing law. And so we're hopeful that the full Court of Appeals will reverse that and send the case back to the Constitutional Court, where we can conclusively show that none of the claims against him can proceed, and that will give him protection. But this all is really a worrying part, to the extent that these conservative courts are like acceding to the president's vision of using solely the immigration laws and the immigration courts and evading like meaningful constitutional review of their conduct. That's what we're fighting for through the habeas case.
And it's worth emphasizing that Mahmoud is a legal resident and is married to a U.S. citizen, and his son is a U.S. citizen.
That's right. He's a lawful permanent resident with a U.S. citizen spouse and a U.S. citizen son who was born while he was in detention, as of course Mahmoud can tell you about. So he's lawfully present here, but they are attempting to revoke his lawful permanent residency, and the immigration courts will likely rubber stamp that. And once again, we're trying to say that that process of revocation to the extent that it's targeting him and others for constitutionally protected speech cannot be lawful. That would violate the Constitution and sort of protect more broadly the constitutional rights of just free speech and dissent.
Mahmoud, I want to go back to your experience in immigration detention, which you have written eloquently about. But is there anything that that the media and even the political opposition is missing about the conditions in those facilities?
Absolutely. Like, as an immigrant in this country, I've never imagined the injustice in the immigration system as a whole, whether the legal part of it, about how unfair or how one-sided it is, like sham courts and sham proceedings in general. But the other part, which I discovered immediately after I entered Gina, Louisiana, like the detention center there, I've never imagined, and like I'm someone who's like very well, like educated about like the politics of the country, but I've never imagined that such injustices happening on U.S. soil. That you go into these detention centers, you share one room with over 70 people. The lights are always on, never off. You have to sleep through that. And the dehumanizing, I would say, rhetoric around like all these inside detention centers. Like around me were people who were picked up from their court hearings, from their ICE check-ins, from their work sites, and they've been called criminals, like all that vilifying language. And everyone's just like confused. So it was like so normal to see just like people crying because they don't know when this is gonna end. It's not like you have a sentence and you committed a crime. There's a sentence. You're staying here for a year or two. No, like you don't know anything happening, and they don't afford you the opportunity to explain to you. So I had to translate to a lot of like Spanish speaking detainees that they did not know what they signed. Because I just told them sign it, you'll figure it out like later. And a week later they were deported without being afforded any opportunity to present their case to any judge whatsoever. And I really fear, and I don't that's why I'm speaking up now, because I don't wanna, in 20 years look at this moment and it is a stain on the rule of law. It is a stain on the U.S. Constitution. No matter what we think about, immigration, whether documented, not documented, legal, illegal, any of that, it's just the fact that such horrendous conditions for profit, like all these institutions are for profit, they get paid by the bed. Like the more they can fill these beds, the more they get paid. The shareholders will profit out of that. So that's why I'm speaking up. It's just I don't want to in 20 years look back and say I wish we did this and that, because it is happening in front of all of us, and no one can unsee all these injustices.
So we're seeing in this country right now a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism, including attacks on Jewish houses of worship. But at the same time, we've seen allegations of anti-Semitism used as a cudgel against people protesting the actions of the Israeli government. You've repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism, but I wonder if you could respond to the accusations about anti-Semitism in the Palestinian solidarity movement.
Yeah. I mean, I must be very unequivocal here. Anti-Semitism is real in this country, and no one can deny that. The other part, no one can justify violence against civilians whatsoever. I would never do that. Not if it's a strategic win, whatever, that's unacceptable. And I believe the movement I was part of is a movement rooted in justice, dignity, safety for everyone. Jewish students, Jewish organizations, Jewish lawyers are an integral part of this movement. And we can't separate that. But what's happening is two things. As you've mentioned, the same way the immigration system is being weaponized, anti-Semitism or claims of anti-Semitism are also being weaponized to silence dissent, to silence any critique of the US support to Israel, to Colombia's support to Israel. That's what I was protesting. I was protesting the use of my tuition dollars, my tax dollars, in funding endless wars against my people. And the second thing is really about trivializing and claims of anti-Semitism, which really hurt the real anti-Semitism in this country. When I'm being accused for anti-Semitism, and it's clear what I was engaged in. It was just, you can call it anti-Israel speech. You can call it pro-Palestine. It's really, you're conflating these two ideas. And then people wouldn't pay enough attention to the real anti-Semitism that's happening, that now, unfortunately, all mainstream Jewish organization in this country, they are disregarding the real anti-Semitism on the Republican Party. We've seen that in New York, in Florida, and just protecting Israel. So that's why I see the role of Jewish organizations is very paramount at this moment, very important. And that's why I work with them, because it is about real solidarity, not about just cosmetic solidarity that see a Palestinian and a Jew are together and fight. No, I want real solidarity, because once again, I believe in our collective liberation, and you can't get Palestinian liberation without Jewish liberation. You can't, these things go intertwined, and that's what I'm fighting for.
Could
Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to add and echo that immensely. Just the other piece of the smear is that Mahmoud and others are pro-Hamas. We'll just sort of throw it out there and let the imagination run with that. And just want to talk about that trigger, that dog whistle, and ultimately, I just need to say it. It's so profoundly anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, and racist. I mean, just the reflexive assumption that an Arab and Palestinian who invokes international human rights and principles of justice and calls for the respect for human life and dignity rooted in deep principles of law and justice, reflexively called Hamas, is just a racist dog whistle. I'm going to say it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have experienced a lot of media scrutiny on that issue, and you did take a position in an interview with CNN that just declining to respond to a demand that you condemn Hamas. So, do you want to explain why you made that choice in that moment?
Absolutely. And I must absolutely start by, I condemn all violence against civilians, no matter who the perpetrators are, whether Hamas, Israel, anyone else. But when Palestinians get to be asked this question, they're not interested in my views about the Palestinian politics. I'm not being, asked to explain my views about the student movement or just the Palestine movement in this country. And that question was asked a month after my release for being targeted politically. And it was sort of a political litmus test. If you say yes, then maybe you're worth listening to. If not, then that would be, you're discrediting you. That's why I refuse to answer the question. It's not about refusing to condemn Hamas or not. If you're interested in my views about Hamas and about the Palestine political atmosphere, I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy to explain that, explain how I grew up in the refugee camp with so many Palestinian factions around me, but they were not interested in that as a whole. And as Baher said, it's very racist to ask a Palestinian this question just to validate their views, because I don't see them asking any Israeli or American politician about condemning all the killing that's happening, whether, you know, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iran, anywhere. So that sort of like hypocrisy and double standards that's being used against us, I refuse to be part of that. And I would never answer such a question in just like a 20-second sound bite, just for them, you know, like to say, oh, he's like, we pushed him, he said that, we pushed him, he did not say that, and then he is Hamas sympathizer or whatever. Or the other part about justifying violence. Once again, like, you can never justify violence, you can never justify October 7, what happened after October 7, but to them, you know, you can never contextualize October 7, but October 7 justifies everything after, which to me is again like that double standard. Like, you have to be very consistent with your values, and that's what I care about, like having consistent values, whether about Palestine, about Israelis, about like whoever, just like that. But like, once again, these are all like deliberate attempts to silence people, because it's easier for them to silence me than to actually engage in the conversation about what's happening. And that's what we're seeing now, in especially when it comes to Israel's attempt to censor the First Amendment in this country. Like, this is really what's happening, to censor any speech that can be remotely critical of the Israeli government.
Speaking of that, you know, you were a part of a robust Palestinian solidarity movement for a time that doesn't appear to be nearly as visible today. Has the Trump administration's repression and the collusion of some universities in that effort been successful in stamping out any outward expression of dissent? Or like, where is the movement now, and where do you see it going from here?
You know, the fear is real, the exhaustion is real, the fear is very real. The amount of violence that was inflicted upon this movement by universities, by the police, by these hate groups is tremendous. But we're seeing that, you know, the public opinion is changing, so it's working, and that explains the crackdown. That explains why the President of the United States came after a nobody. Like, that explains it, and that, to me, you know, this means that we're winning. Just recently, you know, the polls that now a majority of the American public favor or sympathize more with the Palestinians. But on the other hand, I think it has something to do with Biden administration and Trump administration. With Biden, you protest because you feel you can move the needle a little bit. But with Trump, it's like plain tyranny. Like, that's what I would say. It's a plain authoritarianism. Like, what can you do to protest? Like, they would not listen. It's clear now, like, you know, the vast majority of the American people are against the war on Iran. The same against, like, the use of tax dollars to fund Israel, but they don't care about that.
Although the anti-ICE protests in Minnesota did seem to be effective.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that what means, like, to have collective power, because unfortunately, like, this administration, they are bullies, and they would continue to push against us. And so unless you stand against that, that's what you do with a bully. Like, you have to stand up to them. Otherwise, they would come and continue to stripe you of everything you have, of every right you have.
You recently went to Washington, and you met with people on the Hill to talk about your case and ICE detention. What did you take away from that?
I feel like there is still a lot of gap between the public opinion and the policy and like policymakers. Yet I think the tide is turning. In the past, Palestine was a liability. Now Israel is the liability, and you can feel that in your conversation
Even in Washington?
Even in Washington. That explains like a lot of people trying to distance themselves from AIPAC, from Israel, like having to be very, like even with the presidential candidates, like when they're being asked about Israel-Palestine now, it's not an outward, unconditional support to Israel. They're taking a different approach, and that's what I felt. The second thing is, I've been to DC like 3 times in the past year, and now it's much easier to explain to politicians because they see that what happened to me was just the beginning. And now they see it everywhere. They started with the Palestinian, then they went after the Somalis, they went after the Latinos, they went after the Venezuelans. And this is what we've been raising the alarm about, that Palestine is only a Trojan horse, that they would prove their blueprint through going after the Palestinians, but eventually the impact of this is going to be everyone. So in my case, for example, now if the administration win this case, this means that all immigrants in this country cannot challenge their detention in ICE detention. So which is very scary, no matter if you are legal resident, illegal resident, or naturalized citizen. Like they can weaponize this immigration against you. You can spend years in immigration detention before you can bring your claims in front of a real judge, which would impact every single one in this country.
I was going to ask you, Bahir, about that as well. Like, how people often say Palestinians are the canary in the coal mine. And like, we've seen that the crackdown on free speech started with pro-Palestinian speech by some of the same people, it's worth noting, who call themselves champions of free speech. But where do you see this going? Like, what are you worried about if it doesn't go in the right direction? Like, what broader liberties are at stake?
Right. Yeah, there's always been what we call a Palestinian exception to the First Amendment, in part because of the dynamic that rather than sort of engage on the merits of the speech, rather sort of smear and silence. And with respect to this our public officials, I mean, can you imagine being so ashamed of of the First Amendment, so cowardly, really, to use like your quasi arm rather than sort of engage in the question presented, which is, should we be continuing to fund, the Israeli government to slaughter people in violation of international law, to imprison and detain them and silence that? I mean, like the petty bullying of that is just it's intolerable. And I'm reminded of there are a number of, in Mahmoud's federal case, got a number of dozens of affidavits from students and faculty members talking about what campus felt like after they disappeared Mahmoud. The chill, the fear, like non-citizens not going to classes, not raising their hand, scrubbing their social media accounts, looking over their back. That was the plan, and I fear that they were sort of test running that to create that climate of fear, not extract it not only from Columbia, but to scale it all over the country. And they, as Mahmoud was saying, they use the immigration power, which is an enormous source of power for the executive branch, as we have seen, to sort of simply round up people, throw them in vans, and send them to the south, out of the country. The other very significant and scary power that the executive branch has is the war power. And like the sort of these arrests and persecution of Palestinian speech, they've been testing the war power for a while. Very early on, they invoked the Alien Enemies Act that allows the president theoretically to deport people from countries with whom we are at war, and they just designated all Venezuelans as enemy aliens because we're at war. We were at war with Venezuela. This was a year ago, sort of manufactured. They're testing that, but now we're actually at war. And they're very mindful of the theories that they pushed so aggressively before that they will surely push again, far beyond merely immigrants or Palestinians, and to those who choose to question U.S. foreign policy.
We're going to go to questions in a couple minutes, but I wanted to ask you both. As you've mentioned, public opinion on Mahmoud and his case has been shifting dramatically, and also support for Trump's aggressive immigration crackdown is down. Sympathy with the Palestinian cause is up. So to end on a more hopeful note, hopefully, does that give you hope for your case and also more broadly for the future of civil liberties here?
I'm absolutely hopeful, very cautiously though, because it's great that the public opinion is changing. It's great that over 50% of American public sympathize with the Palestinian, but at what cost? It took the killing of over 75,000 Palestinians to reach that level, and what that means to Palestinians now on the ground who are being slaughtered in Gaza, who are being stopped at checkpoints, who are being terrorized by settlers in the West Bank. It means nothing. So it's absolutely I'm hopeful, and I'm also hoping this would change. There's absolutely no need for the use of our tax dollars to fund war anywhere, whether it's Israel, whether it is Egypt, anyone, because we don't have healthcare. There is no free college. All these billions of dollars that are now being spent on war, whether in Iran and Israel, it can get us so many, and it's our money. It's not the government money. It is my own money being used to kill my own people.
Right. I think people are waking up to that.
Yeah, I have to remain hopeful about his legal case and what it more broadly represents, and more hopeful in this moment. I'm glad you brought up Minnesota. I think that's the model, and as the lawyer on the panel here, I want to reassure you, the courts will not save us. You can't rely on lawyers and courts, especially not with this Supreme Court. What Minnesota taught us is that the only answer is to organize. That creates a profound political consciousness of what's actually happening, and the demonstration of love and care and community. That's the only answer in this authoritarian movement. And I also just want to take a second to sort of recognize the incredible, in terms of political consciousness, the incredible courage and power of the Palestinian movement, particularly the Palestinian student movement, who, like prior movements before, will not accept the kind of status quo, but like prior movements before, the women's movement and the Black freedom movement really teach us what our Constitution means. And I think we need to build on their example and the example in Minnesota and meet this moment.
Great, thank you. All right, so we have some questions here. I'll start with a very important one. How are Noor and Dean doing?
Thank you. No, they're doing great. Dean now is turning 11 months. It's a lot. It's a very special feeling. Noor is doing good. It's just I just feel so sad that we're forced to live this life now while we're supposed to just be a small family living our life, go with Dean and Noor to the park. But now no, it's the total like opposite, just like living, in limbo. Like that's what I say. So we're living it like day by day. But I'm like so thankful, like of course for Noor, who has been like held the fortress when I was in detention.
Was the arrest a response to the online smear campaign, or was the smear campaign an intentional and planned setup for the arrest?
No, it was absolutely planned. These institutions, in the past, like their business model was smear, intimidate these individuals who are daring to talk about Palestine, and we will ruin your life. We would go after your job. We would go after your school, after your parents' jobs. But with this new administration, this anti-Palestinian racism became very institutional. So they saw an opening, I think the same day that Trump issued that executive order in January, the same day Canary Mission and Bitar submitted my name to the administration. So it's absolutely planned, like just like one way to silence any dissent.
Historically, U.S. imperialism has destabilized many countries, including Palestine. What is the responsibility of those living within the imperial core?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I guess one responsibility is to sort of reflect back this particular understanding, because so much of this country is diluted with these sort of fantasies about American exceptionalism that make historic and fairly naked imperialism sort of glossed in, some democratic veneer. I mean, for the Trump administration, they've taken off the veneer. They're not talking about democracy. There's a pure, extractive, thuggish cult of violence and taking. And so I don't see how we can turn away from that now. We can't pretend it's not happening. It's threatening the sort of world order and the domestic order. So that's the first responsibility. And the second responsibility is to sort of call it out through organizing in civic spaces, pressure on elected representatives, and again, being in the streets as much as possible to register our opposition.
Very important question. What can people do to support Mahmoud's case and make sure he can stay in the U.S.?
The first thing, continuing to speaking up for Palestine, because again, that's the real issue, and everything else is a distraction. The second thing is, now my fate is in the hand of courts, but as Bahir said, we can't blindly trust the courts, especially now in this at this time. So really mobilizing and the usual things, contact your Congress members, all of that, that is very helpful. I'm very thankful I have a very strong legal team, over 20. I don't think anyone should have 20 lawyers just to get off ICE detention. So I'm very grateful for that. So supporting these organizations, CCR, ACLU, CLEAR, and I think these are the public interest organizations that really they need the support, because they are fighting in court to make sure that our rights are protected, because we shouldn't take these rights as granted, as was obvious in my case.
How has your experience affected your views about the professed values and ideals of the United States?
I lived in Syria for 18 years, and in Syria, authoritarianism, this autocracy was very visible. There was no as like veneer about like having freedom of speech. You know, if you speak out, you'll be detained, you'll be disappeared. And that's why basically I was forced to flee Syria, because I spoke out against the Assad regime, against the killing of Syrian people, against the exploitation of Palestinians to suppress Syrians. But back then I had that view that the American, I would say, principles are so strong. And there is promise, like, you know, the Constitution is in theory, it's great. It's just like you need to protect it, the rule of law, the freedom of speech, the justice and liberty are all like great values, and that's why like we're fighting for them. But again, like I was very shocked to see the Palestine exception in this country at every level, whether it is government level, whether it is institutions, academia, journalism. There's always that Palestine exception that I was like, how can this happen in a country that champions freedom of speech, champions academic freedom? But everything collapses when Palestine enters the frame.
I mean, that could be changing, at least with the change in public opinion around Palestine. But.
I hope so.
Okay, how about this one? I strongly support free political speech. The Columbia encampment had areas marked no Jews. This is definitely anti-Semitic. Mahmoud, did you ever denounce this?
I would absolutely denounce this if it happened, but it did not happen. In fact, we had Shabbat dinners, we had Seder at the encampment, and believe me when I say like really Jewish students were an integral part of the encampment itself as well.
Maybe it was no Zionists, people did
not
didn't
even,
say that?
I mean, it's more about protecting the students of harassment. There were a lot of students who would come in to smear and to basically intimidate the other students to get like a 5-second video to post on social media, see like how anti-Semitism like at Columbia. And just think about it, like the encampment happened in a central, closed area. The students just wanted to be there. They were not stopping anyone from going to classes. They were not stopping anyone from entering the space. In fact, you know, an Israeli flag was being waved inside the encampment. No one did anything to that person. It's just like the students wanted to protect themselves against the harassment and intimidation, and that what happened. But I absolutely would denounce any remote like example of anti-Semitism that would happen in the whole movement. There might be some individual incidents, but I don't think that's representative of the full view of the hundreds of students who participated in these encampments. But that's again part of the deliberate misinformation and disinformation about the student movement, what the students care about, who they are.
How many Jewish students?
And how many? Yeah, and you would be surprised. And that's one of the things I was surprised here about, like how much, Jewish students and just like Jewish citizens are engaged in Palestine, because they feel that all these crimes, they are being held hostage by a state committing crimes in their name. So they want to show up to say that, no, it's not in our name. And that's the biggest fight against anti-Semitism.
That's good. Just a 10-second anecdote. So in Mahmoud's federal case, we had dozens of affidavits from faculty and students, particularly Jewish faculty and students, to talk about how precisely what Mahmoud was saying, how peaceful the movement was, how respectful it was. And what comes to mind is a statement, a letter from one Jewish student who's an undergrad and feeling, on the one hand, a little bit nervous about the message she was getting, on the other hand, horrified about what was happening in Gaza. And she just simply wrote, Mahmoud Khalil did more to protect me from anti-Semitism on campus than Columbia University ever did.
How can we best counter the weaponization of anti-Semitism and unite against injustice? We only have a couple minutes, but I think that's a strong question to end on.
I believe, I think now like people are waking up to that, but like the best thing is really to me is a rights-based approach. It's not about who you are. It's not about like what's your nationality is. It's not about like what background, national, sexual, economic background. Like we should fight for everyone's freedom, everyone's safety, everyone's dignity. And we should, because they want to divide us. They want to create this division. They want to create this conflation, just to distract us from what really matters, which is really like everyone's safety, everyone's happiness. This is like the ultimate good of life, like just like happiness. And they believe just like to really engage in meaningful solidarity, not symbolic ones, like to actually go and build this cross-movement solidarity, whether, you know, with again, with Jewish students, but also like it goes beyond that with the immigrants community, with the LGBTQ community, with the black students or the black community. Like it goes way beyond just like Palestinians and Jews. Like it goes way beyond that.
Do you have anything further, Bahira, on that subject?
What he said.
I guess we can squeeze in one more question. Much of what has happened here is a result of the extreme nature of the Trump administration. How much hope do you have that a Democratic administration would, you know, help you?
Like the system that we are experiencing now is a result of politicians from both parties. It's not only the Trump administration. And this is when I say like status quo Democrats would not help the cause at all. Like even when people say like, oh, maybe, you know, Kamala wouldn't have arrested you. Yes, I know, but my people would still be killed. And once again, I would rather a naked politician than someone who would gaslight me into like, no, we support academic, like freedom of speech, we support like the humanitarian access to Palestinians at the same time that they are funding the bombs that kill these Palestinians that they are claiming to feed. So I really don't have much hope in that, like but again, like now I think even with the Democratic Party, they're realizing that all this shifted, and status quo would not help us because status quo Democrats are what brought Trump, and if they continue to be the same, we will have another Trump in a few years.
Yeah. Great. Well, we're at time. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Mahmoud, Baher. Thank you for being here.
No, thank you so much, everyone. And I really want to just end it by saying, you know, my case is only one case. It stands at the intersection of what this country is arguing about who has the right to have rights, about what we owe each other, about who belongs here. Also, I hope like people will take away that the fight for Palestinian freedom and the fight for civil liberties are the same fight, and it has always been. Thank you.